Pilot 472, coordinates are wrong. Please repeat. The radio crackled through the static-filled cockpit. Coordinates are correct. Control, -472. There's no fire in that sector. Marcus Webb switched off the radio with a deliberate click, his weathered hands steady on the controls, despite knowing this decision would end his 17-year career as an aerial firefighter. Yet he banked the massive CL-415 water bomber toward the coordinates where no flames danced, no smoke rose, because somewhere in that green expanse of California wilderness, the voices of children who died 40 years ago were calling to him again, pleading in a language most Americans had forgotten, words his grandmother might have understood. The Silverwood National Forest was burning through its third day of hell. 12,000 acres already turned to ash and memories, the air thick with smoke that made the sun look like a dirty penny hanging in the apocalyptic sky, and Marcus sat in the cockpit with bloodshot eyes and 3 days of stubble, his flight suit stained with sweat and coffee, having slept maybe 6 hours total since the fire started its rampage through the drought-brittle undergrowth. His co-pilot Trevor Matthews, just 28 with a kind of rigid spine that came from flight school rather than combat, still believing in rules and protocols and the chain of command that Marcus had learned to question in Desert Storm, watched nervously as they veered away from Sector 7 Alpha, where the real fire raged like an orange monster devouring everything in its path. Captain Webb, Control Tower, says northeast slope is priority. We've got homes in the direct path. Why are we heading southwest? Trevor's voice pitched higher with each word, his training fighting against his respect for the legendary pilot beside him, the man who'd pulled off impossible rescues in Australia, who'd been decorated twice for valor, who'd never ever made mistakes. Marcus didn't answer immediately, his gray eyes fixed on something beyond the hazy horizon, beyond the physical world perhaps, seeing something in the empty air that Trevor couldn't perceive, while 6 tons of water sloshed in the plane's belly, every drop precious in this drought-stricken summer where rain hadn't blessed the earth in 4 months. Yet he was taking it to where no fire existed, at least not one that satellites or spotters could see. The Canadair CL-415 was a beautiful machine, painted yellow and red like a warning, designed to scoop water from lakes and drop it with precision on flames that could jump highways and create their own weather systems, and Marcus had flown her for 7 years, knew every rivet, every vibration, every sound she made when she was happy or stressed, and right now she was humming with purpose as they descended toward coordinates that made no sense to anyone but him. The plane descended over pristine green forest, untouched by flame or smoke, just pine trees swaying in the afternoon breeze that carried the scent of resin and earth, a paradise compared to the hellscape they'd left behind, and Trevor was practically screaming now, "Captain, this is insane. We're wasting critical resources. People could die because we're not where we're supposed to be." But Marcus only gripped the controls tighter, his knuckles white beneath sun-damaged skin, remembering the first time he'd heard them 17 years ago during the Riverside Complex fire. It had been just whispers then, children's voices and the roar of the flames, speaking words that sounded like "Pomo Ganam," "Okel Nas," which his Polish grandmother would have recognized as "help us, save us," but he'd dismissed it as exhaustion, as the mind playing tricks after too many hours in the air, too much smoke in his lungs despite the oxygen mask. But the voices had returned with every major fire, always from the same direction, always at the same time of day when the sun hit that particular angle that turned the forest golden. And over the years he'd started marking the coordinates, noting the pattern, realizing that something impossible was happening, something that would end his career if he ever spoke about it to the psychologists who evaluated pilots after traumatic missions. Now, at 53, with retirement beckoning anyway, with his wife Sarah gone to cancer 2 years ago and his daughter living in New York, pretending he didn't exist because she blamed him for being gone during her childhood, fighting fires. Instead of attending recitals, he had nothing left to lose except perhaps his sanity, which Trevor clearly thought was already gone. "I'm calling this in." Trevor reached for the radio, but Marcus grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "You do that, son, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Trust me on this one thing, just this once." The younger man looked into Marcus's eyes and saw something there that made him pull his hand back. Not fear exactly, but a certainty that transcended logic. The kind of look his grandfather had when he talked about knowing things without knowing how he knew them. Marcus hit the release button at exactly 2:47 p.m. At the same time the Pine Creek Village had first reported fire 40 years ago, according to the archives he'd researched during sleepless nights, sending 6,000 liters cascading down like Artificial rain on trees that didn't need saving, at least not in this century, not in this timeline, not in the world where cause and effect moved in predictable straight lines. Trevor's mouth hung open in disbelief as he watched the water disperse into mist, catching the sunlight like diamonds before disappearing into the green canopy below. What did you just do, Captain Webb? What have you done? There's no fire here. But Marcus only exhaled slowly, a strange peace settling over his weathered features like morning fog on a lake, as he whispered, I know, but can you hear it? The silence. For the first time in 17 years, they're quiet now. When they landed at the makeshift airbase carved out of an old logging camp, operations manager David Chen was waiting on the tarmac, his face purple with rage that made the veins in his temples pulse visibly, 3 security guards flanking him, like enforcers from a bad movie. And he screamed across the noise of the cooling engines and the distant sound of other planes taking off for legitimate targets. Webb, you just wasted 6 tons of water on the most critical operation day of the year. Sector 7 Alpha is burning toward Henderson Creek while you're playing games with empty forest, dumping water on nothing. The other pilots and ground crew gathered around in a loose circle, nobody speaking because Marcus Webb was legendary in the firefighting community. 17 years without a single operational mistake. A Desert Storm rescue pilot who'd flown into Baghdad under fire, who'd saved 200 people in the 2009 Australian bushfires by flying through smoke so thick other pilots wouldn't dare enter it. Yet here he was, seemingly lost in some private madness that none of them could understand. You're done, Webb, finished. I'm pulling your license and you'll never fly anything bigger than a paper airplane again, Chen continued, spittle flying from his mouth, his clipboard shaking in his hand as he wrote up the termination papers right there on the tarmac. Marcus removed his helmet slowly, deliberately, his gray hair plastered with sweat that dripped down his neck, staining the collar of his flight suit darker, and asked quietly, so quietly that everyone had to lean in to hear over the ambient noise of the firefighting operation. David, have you ever heard of Pine Creek Village? Ever wondered why that section of forest has been so resistant to controlled burns? Why the trees there grow different from everywhere else? Chun's face scrunched in confusion, his anger momentarily displaced by bewilderment. What? No, what the hell does that have to do with anything? Are you having some kind of breakdown? Should I call medical? That's when old Barbara Holden, the 73-year-old weather analyst who'd been doing this job since before Chen was born, who'd seen fires that made this one look like a campfire, stepped forward from the crowd with a yellowed map trembling in her arthritic hands, her voice cracking with age and emotion as she said, I heard of Pine Creek, summer of '83, terrible fire that nobody talks about anymore. Wind shifted without warning. Santa Anas came 2 months early. She spread the map on the ground, kneeling despite her bad knees that everyone could hear popping, pointing with a gnarled finger to exactly where Marcus had dropped his water, her nail tracing the boundaries of something that wasn't marked anymore. Right here. Pine Creek Village stood here, 47 people lived there. Polish and Czech immigrants mostly, came after World War II, built their own little community away from the cities because they'd seen enough of civilization's worst face. The crowd pressed closer, even Chen's anger dimming as Barbara continued, her voice stronger now, carrying the weight of hidden history. When the fire started on August 15th, they got the evacuation order, but the families were scattered, some at work in the valley, kids at 3 different schools because the village was too small for its own, and the water bombers, they went to the wrong coordinates. A communication error because someone wrote down Pine Creek when the fire was actually at Pine Ridge 15 miles away. Marcus dropped to his knees beside the map, his finger tracing the spot where a village once stood, where families had built homes with their own hands, where children had played in streets that no longer existed. I hear them every fire years now, same place, same time of day, always when the sun hits that angle. Children's voices crying Pomóż nam, Okal nas, which means help us, save us in Polish. But not just that, sometimes I hear singing, a lullaby my grandmother used to sing, sleep, sleep, my dear child. Trevor laughed nervously, trying to break the tension that hung over them like smoke. Come on, Captain, you're telling us ghost stories now. This is crazy. We're supposed to be men of science, not supernatural believers. But his laugh died when he saw the faces around him. The older firefighters who'd been doing this long enough to know that fire had its own logic, its own memory, its own debts to collect. Just then, a young forest ranger came running from the command post, his tablet in his hand, his face pale despite the heat. Director Chen, we just detected something weird, where Captain Webb dropped the water. Thermal imaging is showing an anomaly. In the ground, something our regular flights missed. Chen grabbed the tablet, his termination paperwork forgotten, fluttering away in the wind from a passing helicopter. What kind of anomaly? Speak clearly. The ranger's eyes were wide as he pulled up the thermal imaging, the screen showing a rainbow of colors where heat signatures painted an invisible picture. Underground heat source, like a peat fire starting, been building for weeks maybe, 3 meters down where our sensors don't usually penetrate. The droughts made the soil so dry it's like tinder down there. And these old root systems from trees that died decades ago, they're like fuses waiting to light. Everyone went silent as the implications hit them, Chun's face draining of color until he looked almost gray in the afternoon light, and the ranger continued, his voice shaking now as he realized what he was saying. That area's bone dry, like it hasn't seen rain in 40 years according to our soil samples. If fire had started there with today's wind patterns. The models show. He paused, tapping the screen to bring up a projection that painted the forest in shades of red, spreading like blood across the map. At least 5,000 more acres would have burned. The fire would have jumped the creek and hit Maplewood subdivision. We're talking about 300 homes, 1,000 people who wouldn't have had time to evacuate. Barbara wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her weathered hand. Mascara she'd worn for 40 years running in black streams down her cheeks. Same place, same conditions. 40 years later to the day almost. Like the forest was trying to repeat its worst mistake. Marcus stood up slowly, his knees cracking from years of hard landings and harder decisions, his eyes distant, focused on something none of them could see, perhaps finally free of something none of them could understand. The voices are gone. Now, 17 years, I've heard them during every major fire. Same coordinates which I memorized like my own name. Same time of day when the sun matches their last afternoon. Like they were waiting, watching, warning about something that hadn't happened yet but would, a debt the forest owed them being called in. Chen placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. His anger completely evaporated like morning dew, replaced by something between awe and shame. I'm sorry, Webb. God, I'm so sorry. I was about to fire you, to end your career in disgrace. I didn't understand. How could I understand something like this? Marcus shook his head slowly, a sad smile creasing his weather-beaten face. Doesn't matter, David. Nobody could understand without hearing them. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone. 17 years of knowing something nobody would believe, of flying toward coordinates that made no sense while people burned elsewhere, fighting every instinct except the one that said listen to them. The next day's local paper ran an interesting headline that would be picked up by wire services and spread across the nation. Pilot saves ghost village, water for Pine Creek. 40 years late, but what really mattered were the stories that started emerging from the woodwork like smoke from hidden fires. Old forest rangers and locals who'd been in the area for decades finally admitting they'd heard things too, especially during fire season when the wind was just right. Children crying in languages their grandparents spoke, voices singing lullabies that hadn't been heard since the old country, all coming from that same spot where Pine Creek Village once stood, where 47 people had tried to build new lives in a new world only to have fire take everything. Marcus Webb retired 2 weeks later with full honors instead of disgrace. Didn't make a speech at his ceremony because what could he say that anyone would understand? Just looked at the map one more time, his finger hovering over Pine Creek like a blessing or a farewell, and whispered so quietly only Barbara heard him. You can rest now. Your warning was heard. Your children saved others. Trevor Matthews never flew the same way again, always listening during every sortie, every fire, wondering if someday he'd hear voices calling him to the wrong coordinates and sometimes, when the smoke was thick and the exhaustion deep, he thought he heard something, not Polish or Czech, but Spanish maybe, from some other tragedy the forest remembered. Barbara Holden died 3 months after the incident, peacefully in her sleep, leaving all her old maps to the firefighting center, with notes on the back of each one written in her spidery handwriting. Remember the forgotten places, they remember us. They erected a memorial where Pine Creek Village once stood, a simple stone marker that tourists rarely found. The inscription worn but still readable, Pine Creek Village founded 1947, lost to fire 1983, 19 souls claimed, 11 of them children, saved thousands 40 years later when pilot Marcus Webb heard their warning, and fresh flowers appeared there regularly though nobody ever saw who brought them. From that day forward, California aerial firefighting training included one more unofficial rule. passed down from veteran to rookie in quiet moments between flights. If you ever hear voices that don't make sense, if you feel pulled toward coordinates that seem wrong, listen anyway. They might be trying to save lives that haven't been lost yet, debts the forest needs to pay. The thermal imaging from that day was archived and studied, showing clearly how the underground fire had been spreading through root systems and peat deposits, following almost exactly the same pattern as the 1983 fire, as if the Earth itself had muscle memory of catastrophe, and Marcus's water drop had penetrated just deep enough to break the chain reaction, to stop history from repeating, to finally answer the call he'd been hearing for 17 years. Some nights, when the California forests are quiet and the fire season seems like a distant threat, rangers on patrol swear they can hear something in the wind near Pine Creek, not crying anymore, not pleading for help, but children laughing, playing free at last from their 40-year vigil, their warning finally delivered, their debt to the future paid by one pilot who was brave enough to seem crazy, to risk everything on voices nobody else could hear, to put 6 tons of water where no fire was. Because sometimes the most important fires are the ones that haven't started yet, and sometimes the dead know more about tomorrow than the living know about today.